Everybody, thank you for joining us today. Whether you are in the Asia Pacific area, which is early morning, or in North America, which is afternoon or late afternoon, we are so privileged to have one of my sister scholars, Dr. Rachel Grant, with us today to talk about a very important topic, critical anti-racist education. And Dr. Grant is professor at CUNY, City University of New York. And without further ado, first of all, please subscribe to our channel and give us a like. And also, we have we have some posters up for upcoming seminars. So we would have something in October and also some seminars in November. So we will have a rich program after a break during the summer. So now, without further ado, Professor Grant will first do a brief presentation, and then it will be open up for discussions. And make sure that you type in your comments, feedback, questions under the YouTube video, and we will also address your questions. Okay, so over to you, Professor Grant, my dear sister, Rachel.
Thank you, my sister, Angel. And let me begin by saying I am indeed honored to engage in conversation about race, racism, and anti-racism in language education with you this evening. I want to ensure that we have time to think, reflect, question, and discuss issues related to my topic this evening, which is lifting the veil of racialization in language education, a view through an anti-racist lens. In my presentation, and hopefully it will continue in our discussion, I attempt to capture the salience of the topic by presenting in brief some of the thoughts of those that help in shaping my perspectives and are at times a source of comfort as I navigate race and racism as the sole African American faculty member in my department and in the School of Education. I'm too modest to offer you solutions because what we are dealing with is historic, is complex, is contextual, painful, and enduring. But through the words of those who helped me in shaping my perspectives and informing my actions, I do offer you some breathing space and the opportunity to think. Before I begin, I'd like you to know that addressing this topic as an African descent individual who is a direct descendant of enslaved Africans, this is not necessarily an easy task for me. I, as are so many who share my history, we are tired and we have become weary of the false starts, half-hearted efforts, and open resistance to recognizing our humanity and right to exist in a country built on the backs of our ancestors. Although my experience and that of my ancestors takes place in an area known as the United States, a land stolen from millions of indigenous people, my experience is not unique to those. As estimates suggest, the 30 to 60 million Africans stolen from their homes to build European empires in the Western Hemisphere. I'm speaking to you at a time when there are those who believe there is cause to hope for truth and transformation to a free, equal, and equitable representative democracy. I, however, am not that optimistic. The privilege enjoyed by those who are white, those who proudly trace their ancestry to Europe, will not go quietly in the night. They are resisting, often through violence, any attempt to disrupt their power, to cure them of the pandemic of racism. It is my hope that in this session, we will perhaps feel, as I do, a sense of urgency that we must take anti racist action now to end racism and its crippling effects on our lives and humanity. The antiquated belief that some groups of people are better than others distort our politics, deforms our policy, cripples our children, destroys our dreams, drains our economy, and erodes everything we have in common. Now I'd like to share with you my presentation. It's a PowerPoint presentation, but first I will let you know I'm not, again, offering solutions. I really want you to use the words that have inspired me, that inform me, to begin to think about the issue of race, racism, and anti-racism. Before I begin, the slide presentation is really organized around three areas. Some thoughts that have encouraged me, informed me, inspired me on race, on racism, and anti-racism. So I'm hoping to speak to you and inspire you through the words that have inspired me. For those of you who don't know, W.E.B. Du Bois is a historic figure in this country and certainly in the African American community. Born but 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he is a noted sociologist, researcher, theorist, activist. These were his words in 1899. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He said these words again in 1925, and I would add, the problem of the 21st century. Race is a child, not the father of racism. These are the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates from his book, Between the World and Me. And even though he's produced a lot of work since then, I see this as by far his best work. It's a short book, and I really encourage you to read it. The great lie at the root of our nation's founding was the belief in the hierarchy of human value. And we are still there. We have not touched the root. This is a quote from Heather McGhee in her most recent book, The Sum of Us, where she looks at the personal and economic cost of racism. My goals for tonight, at least to get us started. I want to identify some of the theories that inform anti-racist action, certainly theories that frame pretty much all of my work, and much of the work of the sister scholars as well. Okay, so that's my first goal. Just not necessarily going into detail about them, but sharing them with you. But I do want to engage in a discussion of the need for critical anti-racist positionality in language education, who it can serve, and ways to take up anti-racist action in language education and research. First, my perspectives on race, and these are the individuals who shape my thinking and actions. Race applied to human beings is a political division. It is a system of governing people that classifies them into a social hierarchy based on invented biological demarcations. These are the words of Dorothy Roberts from her book, Fatal Inventions, which she chronicles the presence of the medical profession in operationalizing, in whatever period of time it happened to be, what race is, who's Black, who's white, who's Asian. And it's a really well researched and chronicled look at the way in which the medicine has propped up our beliefs about race. Race is very real as a political grouping of human beings and has actual consequences for people's health, wealth, social status, reputation, and opportunities in life. Again, the words of Roberts. Race powerfully implicates and orients schooling. And these are the words of Day, a researcher I fairly recently discovered, but he's actually a scholar in Canada. He is Ghanaian, but he is teaching in Canada. Next, just some perspectives on racism. Again, I share some quotes from work that informs me. Racism is to suggest that one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. And these are the words of Ibram Kendi from his recent book, How to Be Anti-Racist. Racism makes race real, so we must deal with both race and racism as tangible, living, and operative living things over and in our world. Again, Day. Racism is essential to the West as water is to human beings. This was one of my most recent readings by Kehinde Andrews, a scholar in Great Britain. And he looks at the New Age of Empire and examines race, not just within the United States, not just North America, but he links it historically to other contexts and other European powers. Racism is a poison first consumed by its concoctors. Kehinde Andrews again. Now, anti-racism. So what are some of the things that people have said about anti-racism, anti-racist actions to move us through? Okay. Anti-racism is a powerful collection of actions of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity. Again, Kendi. Education must be able to engage race and social difference as intrinsic to the identities and lived experiences of learners. It is the crux of Anti-Racism Education Day. And I have to put in a sister scholar here. The complex nature of racism invites ELT professionals to engage in critical anti-racist pedagogy, which requires decentralizing, desimplifying, desilencing, decolonializing anti-racism. Kaboto. As promised, here are a few, and this is not an extensive or exhaustive list of the theories. And as I work and I grow, I continue to discover new things that are in affecting me and help me to analyze and problematize race and racism and anti-racism. First, the most almost overarching theory is critical race theory. Okay, womanist feminist theory, endarkened feminist epistemology, critical multiracism, intersectionality, which in every theory that precedes it enables us to understand these complex relationships of language and family and generation and gender and class and context. Lat crit, Asian crit, and indigenous feminist epistemologies, as well as LGBTQ, POC, people of color. So these are some of the theories that certainly inform my work over the past 10 years, and I would say probably even longer. So we focused on what's inspired my work in terms of defining race and racism. So here are some of the thoughts of others that about how do we achieve anti-racist, socially just language education. And I begin with Kubota. Teachers and educators must develop a critical awareness, knowledge, and stance regarding issues of racism and anti-racism. In my work and in my teaching, that's where I believe you have to begin. You have to begin with self-examination. To raise awareness, teachers and teacher educators need to engage in continuous professional development. One workshop on anti-racism won't do it. Continuous professional development to learn about racism and anti-racism individually and how it operates collectively. Awareness raising for teacher and learners should be done in a dialogic manner rather than top-down lecturing. Okay. A final thought by Kubota. Critical anti-racist pedagogy is about fostering awareness, knowledge, and attitudes regarding the intrinsic nature of racial inequities and approaches to challenge them. I think you will see as I present some more thoughts about how to achieve anti-racism, that it is long-term and it's enduring, because that's how our societies have been infected by racism. Okay. Now I turn to the work of Day. What can we do to achieve anti-racist and socially just language education? Gain critical awareness of ourselves and of our place in community. Ignite community transformation. Help learners develop interrogative voices. Nurture learners' capacity for resistance. Use action-oriented pedagogies to challenge privilege and power. Clarify the functions of white power and white privilege. Not just label it, but clarify, what does it look like, okay? And how do we act upon it? Bring to the fore broader questions about colonialism, imperialism, expansion, and discretionary use of white power and privilege. In the United States, it's remarkable in ways in that many Americans don't acknowledge that the United States is a colonial nation. They don't necessarily understand the relationship to colonizing and the impact it's had on the indigenous people in this the nations of this nation. They don't. It's very easy for Americans to talk about England as a colonial power, France or Spain, but they don't see the coloniality of the United States. And a final comment by Day. We must not position difference as the problem. Rather, we must work with strength of difference, welcoming difference as an opportunity for us to grow together as a nation, as a community. Now, my thoughts. Okay, so taking everything that I've been reading and thinking and doing. So, how do I see us achieving an anti-racist, socially just language education? Think first, engage in advocacy, but first, seek advice and listen to the voices of those for whom you wish to advocate. Remember, silence equals complicity. Speak up and speak out when you observe racism and engage in corrective action. Confront, examine, interrogate, and take action to remove Europeanism, Americanism, whiteness, and English hegemony and ELT. Again, continuing with my thoughts, and this is after the reading that I've done and the work that I've done, and I'm still adding to this. Recognize the permanence of racism by engaging in consistent action to eliminate social, political, economic policies within ELT and the broader society that sustain the inequities of racism. Engage in candid, ongoing self-examination of our assumptions about race and the other. And this is one thought that I've seen across everything that is written from a critical race or anti-racism perspective. Act to change our assumptions through reading, discussion, and engagement with the other as we develop knowledge and work to ameliorate our bias and essentialized assumptions. And finally, recognize that ELT curriculum, teaching, and research should be designed with knowledge of the socio-cultural, socio-political, socio-economic, socio-historic, geopolitical, and ethno-racial context. Okay. Thank you for inviting me, and I welcome your questions in our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grant. Thank you so much, Rachel. Your presentation is short but powerful, and it does remind us of the urgency for all generations of scholars, whether we are emerging scholars or early career or older scholars. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Bongi, emerging scholar, to ask our first questions.
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Rachel Grant, for bringing this topic in very hard and challenging times. This is a very important question, but often very much silenced. And one thing that comes to my mind is the discussion of race itself is very difficult to discuss. And then I think what Kubota in her article mentions, race and language, juxtaposing language and race is a very challenging topic, and especially it's very much silenced in ELT education. And my question is related to that line of thoughts. First of all, I come from South Korea as a relatively educated middle-class family in a rural area where I did not have to experience race or racism because I was a mainstream race. But as I moved to US and work and study in Canada, I become the Asian woman, and how I become the racialized the other. which is a very unique or sometimes very overwhelming experience. And as I'm engaging with some of the pre-service teachers, teacher education program, or collaborating with other disciplinary faculties for higher education, or confronting with multilingual students in K-12 context, I do see myself being often racialized as woman of color. And often my voices or my thoughts are being minimized than the other, or being challenged by the other, and or not legitimate, and or sometimes in explicit or explicit manner, and it is very challenging to navigate this. And as you, who I really who has gone through navigated different challenges, and who has coped with different possibilities, I want to ask questions to you. Although you mentioned already that you're not here to provide solution, but at least a tip of how do we question this? Because often race language, anti-race language education is not even being able to be raised or spoken. People react to it, and then once a person like me are raising this issue, doesn't even become taken seriously. Oh, people say, "Oh, you're doing another race card here again." So I'm asking you. I know I'm getting a lot of questions jumbled in some ways, but how do we even start raising this issue from the very first place in a not antagonistic or defensive manner?
No, I fully understand your question. And my short answer is, for me, all I have to do is walk in a room. Race is always on the table. I'm the only Black faculty, and in some cases, teacher my students have ever had in life. So it's raised as soon as I walk into the room or appear on camera. I believe, and this is what has worked for me, I don't ignore it. I honestly, especially if I'm in a new context, the very first class session, I introduce myself as a Black woman, a woman of color, and I begin from there. One of the courses, I won't go into a lot of detail, but one of the courses that I teach, that I don't like the title, but it's too political to change the title, but it's called Multi-Ethnic Foundations of Education. And typically, as a coordinator of the TESOL program, that's usually one of the first course that students take in our program. And I designed it, and I usually teach it. And the first day of class, I tell students, you will be uncomfortable in here. And that's what I expect. If you're not uncomfortable, then I'm not doing my job. Because I know some of the topics we discuss, and I start with race. I put it on the table. And all of the topics that I cover are also within the context of language. This whole intersectionality of race and language and nationality and religion, and how they play out in every classroom and in the language classroom as well. I have students begin with an analysis of self. I call it a self-identity study. And I provide very explicit guidance in terms of, you must address race, you must address gender or sexual orientation, you must address what religious or spiritual influences inform your life. And the goal is for them to begin to see what are the influences on them as a teacher and hopefully a future language educator. You have to start with being honest with yourself. My students know in that assignment, I'm the only one who ever sees it. And it is incredible how candid some of that they are. I hopefully, and that's key too, establish a safe space for them to begin that exploration. So by them knowing I'm the only one that is going to see that assignment, they reveal things that other students in the classroom have no idea about them. I remember one student in particular thinking through in this assignment why she was prejudiced against Black people. And it went back to a childhood experience she had in elementary school when the only Black friend she had, the boy that she liked her friend, and not her. And I mean, she acknowledged, she said, I just realized it goes all the way back to that, where this girl was supposed to be my friend. My boy, the guy I liked her. So that made me suspicious of her. So she was no longer my friend. And she revealed, and that just stayed, she said, that stayed with me. That has stayed with me my entire life. So it's just things as simple as that, or as complicated as families that have that instill and pass on through generations their racist ideas and perspectives. But for me, I walk into class and race is always on the table, but I don't ignore it. But I do it in a way that I help students feel comfortable and gives them a safe space to think about themselves and who they are and what their influences are, how they got to be who they are, and how they will move forward with that knowledge as they prepare to teach language learners.
In that note, how do you collaborate with your colleagues or your faculty who are predominantly white and who often denies or not want to see the race?
Let's just say I have been places where that is not possible, but I've never been at an institution where I didn't find at least one ally. Occasionally it's been another person of color. I have quite a extensive Asian network, through my professionally, through my doctoral students. And I've managed to find at least one person. Sometimes it takes a lot of work, or it takes time, I'll put it like that. But I also, especially now that I'm a senior faculty member, I also believe in mentoring. And often it will be that one faculty member, that new faculty member who I can see may be struggling, and I initiate the collaboration. But first, I do it out of knowledge of their work. I make sure I've read something so we have that connection, so they can see I'm not just looking to gain another publication. I'm genuinely interested in the work that they're doing. So at this point, I'm working with one junior faculty in my department on actually anti-racism in teacher education. I'm working with another faculty member who is working in the area of translanguaging. I am working with, and we have a manuscript under review. About 3-4 years ago, I had the opportunity to teach a course in Thailand and loved it. So I was there for about 6 weeks. So one of the doctoral students and I have submitted for publication an article that looks at race and ELT within the Thai context. Really interesting. I'm hoping it, we make it. So that's basically what I do. I find out that I take the time to know who my colleagues are and identify those through observation who I believe would be open. But I find that seeking out junior faculty and my doctoral students are ways for me to collaborate, and that sustains my work, and I enjoy it very much.
Thanks, Rachel. Talking about translanguaging, I'd like to invite Phoebe, especially in the Asian Pacific context, East Asian context, this native speakerism, this English is equated to white people's English. And this is embraced, this desire is embraced by a lot of Asian parents and students themselves. And it's this kind of internalized discrimination. So I'd like Phoebe to raise your question, Phoebe.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lin, and thank you, Rachel, for explaining to us how to consider different critical issues about socially just education. From my perspective in Hong Kong, because actually we would like to pursue good education, quality education, but from the local parents, the Asian parents or Hong Kong parents' perspective, very often we try to model the native speakers, their living style, their understanding of knowledge, value, subject matter. So I know that from you and also other sister scholars, you have been designing some pedagogical tools or some coursework like you just introduced to us for your students. What would you suggest us as teachers through some activities or discovery activities in education that may support our students further, especially when they are younger students like kids or teens? They are still struggling for their self-identification in the process of learning. What would you suggest?
I think for younger students, and I certainly use this many years ago when I was in a K through 12 classroom, literature. I have found that it's as an entree at any grade level. And we live in a day and age where there's so much high quality, multicultural, transnational texts that are available. Those that are bilingual, they'll have English or Chinese or Mandarin or Cantonese on one side and English on the other side. So for working with younger students, literature, it always affords that safe space for a personal connection. I also have used with undergraduate students narrative research. One of the books that I used, and this particular course was a combination. It was a literacy course, but in every literacy course I teach, you must do literature. So every teacher must know the importance of literature for actually breaking barriers around race and culture and language as well. So with younger students, I've introduced literature. They have this remarkable way of identifying with the character who just happens to be Chinese or who just happens to be Black, or who just happens to be from Thailand or who happens to be from Nigeria. So I found literature as a wonderful way to lower that tension around race, around language, and around difference. And I've used it in the K through 12 classroom, and with even when I don't teach undergraduates anymore, but when I taught undergraduates, one of the books I used, I remember it so vividly because again, I was at that time the only African-American professor at this particular university, but the book was called Other People's Words. And it was a book about the Appalachian poor white family and the mother's struggle to get a quality education for her son. And I never, every year I signed this book, invariably one of my white students would ask, Dr. Grant, I never knew that white people could be treated this way. And it was like, yeah, that also allowed them to see class, to really see class. That's one of those other intersections that impacts our work with racism and anti-racism class as well. So I would say literature, and even with teachers, especially with really reluctant, resistant teachers, literature is an entree.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have some feedback comments here from PQ. Hi, PQ. Our schools, SFU, administrative body and curriculum specialists are predominantly white. They advocate anti-racism by referring to Eurocentric articles. I always find them a bit hypocritical and pretentious. Yeah, I certainly agree with your comment. And then PQ also said, I found it extremely uncomfortable when our year one education course at SFU chooses to teach students to unpack their unlearned privilege by referring to Peggy McIntosh's white article, 1987. I would hurry to say, let's look at one of our sisters' article, Stephanie. So, Rachel, maybe you have something to say to PQ? I find those comments very valid.
An Angel can attest to this, and sometimes I have a voracious appetite for reading. So I read anthropologists, I read sociologists, I read history, my first love. I read across, feminist scholarship. There's so much out. I can't keep up with it, So in terms of your colleagues, I would say I will be more than happy to share a list of readings with them. In fact, all of my references are published, are in the PowerPoint. I'll make sure I share that with you. All of the individuals that I cited in my presentation and some additional ones will appear in the references, and that's a good place to start. However, I welcome someone who emails me, I'd be more than happy to share with you the just enormous amount of work, current and older, some that's really sort of groundbreaking. It kind of grounds us, but a lot that has come out in the last 5 years. I literally cannot keep up with it. But you have to be willing to read across different genres. You sometimes you may not find it all in ELT. So I read outside of my field, and that informs me tremendously.
Right. So I have here a question from Kelly. Kelly is now in Guangzhou in China. Kelly says, what are the differences between critical pedagogy and critical anti-racism pedagogy? Can we say that critical pedagogy encompasses critical anti-racism pedagogy? In what ways can critical anti-racism pedagogy change current situations in language education?
I think often, and again, it can sometimes depend on who the author is, who the researcher is. Critical pedagogy doesn't necessarily examine racism. It doesn't. It may look at class, it may look at gender, but it doesn't often look at race and doesn't also look at the intersections of those other identities along with race. So I would say primarily the difference is in critical anti-racist pedagogy, race It's centered on race. It's centered on acknowledging that race can transcend all of those other identities and impact it.
I find that a lot of my colleagues they would say, "Oh yeah, I do CP, critical pedagogy," but whereas they have the slightest ideas, just like what you said, it's not the same. It's actually very, very different. And then I have a question from April Liu from Education University of Hong Kong. Thanks a lot for initiating this important discussion. May I ask a question about the Sister Scholars 2021 article on strategies for sisterhood in Language Education Academy regarding agency and imagination? What are the pedagogical strategies to ignite and maintain the imagination for alternative discourses and identities in the anti-racist project, when the reality could be quite depressing for teachers and students?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Agency and imagination. I think that's my section. Wow. I think one of the first things for me, and wow, my journey has been a little, I've taken some twists and turns along the way, but I would say, for me, in maintaining my agency, is acknowledging, regardless of what I think of myself. That's when people say, well, race is a political construct. It's real. I breathe it. I eat it. I sleep it. I live it every single day. So it is real. And in establishing my agency, everywhere I went, I knew that the likelihood was, I hoped it would be different, but I knew that the likelihood would be I would be treated differently. I would be viewed differently. I would have more work. I would teach more students. I would teach more undergraduates. I would have more advising than anyone else. Okay. So part of getting agency for me is acknowledging the reality of my circumstances. Okay. Not ignoring it, not hoping it would go away. And then in doing that, I focused a lot on my self-care, because I know to navigate the racist institutions that I have found myself in, I would have to be imaginative in how I took care of myself. So I would do things for myself, like subscribe to the ballet. A couple years I subscribed to the opera, subscribed to the symphony. Every theater in Washington, D.C., which is, by the way, where I am, I have had a subscription to at one time or another. I also have now, I always say I practice yoga. It's good for me, but I'm not good at it, but I work on it. I also, my best therapy is reading. And Angel, the sister scholars, will tell you, every time we meet, I have like 10 books. Oh, I read this, let me share that. So that's therapy for me as well. The other thing is music. I make it a point of having, and my iPad will probably blow up soon, but I have every genre of music, and I find that soothing. So in terms of helping to establish my agency, is one, being realistic about the circumstances that I find myself in, knowing that I will probably be overworked and I have to protect myself so that I can be there for the students. And that's the other thing I've learned in navigating academia, is that 90% of my students really want to know. I mean, they have had no one before in their entire schooling that has openly said, I'm Black, welcome to my world, and I'm explicit and I'm specific in talking about these issues, but I always try to do it in a way that nurtures and helps students feel safe in revealing. And I focus on those 90%. And sometimes it's 98%. But that helps me. So in terms of and some of the other strategies I mentioned, like going into my dead zone, I still do that. I did that yesterday. But anyway, just kind of protect yourself. Because often as a person of color, and for me, the only African American, I know the only thing they want is somebody in the room who looks like me. They don't really care about what I think. They don't want to hear from me. They just want to be able to say they have a diverse faculty. So for me, I just spend that time in my head so I'm not injured by what's going on around me. And agency and imagination, and some of the others are in our article.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, looking after my emotional well-being is first priority, especially for women scholars of colors, because we always think, we can't say no, or we need to be polite. I'd like to raise a question about emotion labor. I find that in my interactions with colleagues, especially white colleagues, I have to take up a lot of emotion labor. That is, I cannot show my real emotions, even when I felt hurt, deeply hurt. I still need to smile, be professional. So I'd like you to speak a bit more, and it has taken a toll on my well-being.
Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah, because I know I'm guilty of having done the same thing, especially earlier in my career. Now because here's part of what I'm dealing with, the stereotypes about African Americans that are still widely held by people. And that is one of being emotional. So I have worked hard, and now it comes really easy, of literally having a stone face. You know, I know what's going on. I'm not ignoring it, but I don't have to acknowledge it. And I don't have to in any way confirm what you believe about people who look like me. So I've done that, and I continue to do that. But that's where my sister scholars come in, because that's where we place it, you know. So having someone or somewhere, you know, to place it on, especially a group such as ours, we understand the academy. You know, it's not like you may have a really good friend, but they may be an accountant, so they don't really get the dynamics of the way race plays out in an academic setting. But for me, I've been really blessed to have a group of like-minded individuals to dump it on, you know. But unlike Angel, I don't smile.
I should learn the stone face. I should learn the stone face posture. Yeah. And I like to go back to Bois, because there are so many microaggressions that's just taking a toll on our well-being, intellectual and emotional well-being. And I'd like to go back to Bois to continue to raise questions.
Just to go back to just a brief comments about the notion of silence. What the discussion between Angel and you raised an issue of silence, and to me, I feel like silence can be seen in two different angles, where silence becomes a form of marginalization, but the silence becomes a form of resistance and disacknowledgement. And then the silence is not about just the linguistic form, but it's the stone face or the emotional, bodily engaged reaction. So I found it's quite interesting, just kind of, I'm just grappling with how the silence can be reshaped in a different form. So just the thought that I have right now. So about microaggression and another, I'm still not really sure how to deal with it, but maybe if I can elaborate something that I've been thinking about, if that's okay. And then maybe I will come back to the issue of microaggression as we discuss our conversation. One of the things that also come up to me is the racial linguistics, and then how the race and language are juxtaposed, and that we often value monolingual speakers who are often presumably white, and then we teach those white English language, and often I'm still not really sure how to deal with this, because this is seen as a resource for accessing the dominant mainstream. But at the same time, even if one acquires sufficient white English language, but they cannot access to the dominant culture and dominant community, they're always being in the margin. They're always being seen as not enough or inferior. And so how to disrupt or challenge that? Like, some people say, let's say we need to shift our frame from completely reestablishing our ways of thinking. Like, let's just get rid of EAP or English for academic purposes or English for specific purposes because it serves the white supremacy. Then some people say, well, we need to navigate how to not only teach the dominant language, but also we need to tell how to negotiate this difficult hierarchies of power. Where can we stand? I mean, I still am not sure. Like, is Hilary Jenks access paradox a better way to do, or do you think Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores' discussion on let's get rid of EAP? Where can we stand?
That's a good question. Interesting too, because that to me speaks to what needs to happen in ELT as far as how it is positioned. So that's one of those policy actions that you have to work towards. And it'll take some work, but I do believe that language educators can begin one place in every course that I teach, and I had the luxury of developing the program that I now coordinate, is language is situational. So I want my teachers to understand that language is situational. And in working with students, I never, it's just my nature. I don't focus on accent. I never have. I think understanding is a matter of listening. So if you know the language and the person is speaking in English, so whatever the accent happens to be, I think listening is key. Because and often, if it's not coming easily to the ear, a lot of people will just shut down or turn off. They don't work at trying to understand. So that's one of the other things that I talk to my students about. Again, from the very beginning throughout the school, we have work to do change that to shift that paradigm. We really do. And it's going to be, yes, it's going to take action on the part of language educators, but it's also going to have to be a matter of policy. So that's when we think about critical anti-racist action, it has to, that we can't just work on preparing educators or researchers. We also have to work on shifting the politics and the policy.
Yes, I think context matters a lot, situation.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no one size fits all. In some contexts, it might be like Jonathan Rosser. Now, I do have a relevant question from Kelly. Kelly and I located in Guangzhou, China, and it's a very pertinent question to what we were just discussing. So here Kelly asked, nowadays, scholars from all over the world publish their work in diverse journals in English to get their voices heard in academia and to get promotion or jobs in their academic careers. And this perpetuates the dominant Anglo-American conventions and the status of English, and not just any English, but certain standardized varieties of English as an academic lingua franca. Will critical anti-racist theory pedagogy destabilize and diversify academic conventions in other languages, such as Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Filipino languages?
I hope so. I really do. I know that and this has been something that has come up with our faculty in looking at, at CUNY, we review people a whole lot. It seems like more than we need to, but anyway, we certainly have several faculty members who are international. I have two colleagues who are from China, one colleague from Japan, one colleague from South Korea, two colleagues from Russia, and there's another, I forget, there's the other, anyway. I personally believe that whatever language they publish in should count towards their should be counted. I have other colleagues that believe differently. And usually from those scholars, it's a combination of their first language, publications in their first language, and publications in English as well. So I don't know if I'm the best judge, because I feel like scholarship counts. So, if the abstract is in English, so at least, with my limited linguistic repertoire, I can see, the accent, the abstract in English, and perhaps there's an opportunity to make sure that a scholar who speaks that language, I mean, there's so many ways to find out the level of scholarship of a particular publication, even if it happens not to be in English. So I just feel that that's one of those things, and it is very contextual in terms of location. But I feel like that's one of those issues in academia that we have to address, especially given the diversity of some of our faculties.
Maybe our sister scholars can start publishing in different languages and have different translations of our.
That's an excellent idea. That's an excellent idea. I know there's some journals, certainly Canadian journals, that are in English and in French. And then there's some journals in literacy, for Reading Research Quarterly will publish at least the abstract in another, actually in sometimes 2 or 3 different languages. So but we need to have more of that.
I'd like to turn back to Phoebe. You have 2 more questions, I noticed, or more.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, I would like to ask for your advice to, again, because I love supporting parents and young kids around me. Nowadays, the Hong Kong people are struggling a lot because we are having a lot of families migrating to to Canada and to the United Kingdom, and because we have experienced social and political unrest, and then a lot of people are imagining that they would lead a better life when they move to a new place. So, as an educator and scholar, what would you suggest if we want to enrich some more, apart from reading stories or literary studies at school? What can we do at home or for parenting to raise the awareness of anti-racist practice, or how do they deal with their social interaction in everyday life? Because it's a very real confrontation, and kids and parents may have struggles as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I certainly know everything that I know about ETL and ESL or EFL, especially ESL, is the importance of family and the importance of community and the importance of engagement. I think some of it depends on the way that family is situated. I know in addressing anti-racism and racism with my students, if they come from families that are, let's face it, racist, it's a lot harder, and it's so ingrained and it's so generational. That's a tough one, because how do you get into the home, and then into the hearts of people? Very, very challenging. I know, especially in this country now, with the effort to not teach critical race theory, even though you wouldn't teach critical race theory to a third grader anyway, so I don't know what they're talking about. It's really difficult to, and some of that is coming from the parents, it's coming from the home. So I almost feel like I don't know if I have a sufficient answer for that at this time, especially when in some cases they are limiting books that teach about Martin Luther King. They say, oh, that's critical race theory. So it's being used in this country as an excuse to eliminate any culture, but everything that's not European. Everything that is not European is being, in some states, eliminated. So we've got a harder job there, and maybe some of the things that we're doing, we're going to have to rethink. For example, we can't. I don't know about in our country. It's just not customary anymore for teachers to do home visits, and there's some places where it is customary. That might be one entree. And especially with COVID now, no one visits the home, so to speak. But I think that's a tough one. I'm almost at a loss at this point, given the political climate that's happening now in this country, where now some of the diverse and multicultural literature is being questioned, and in some states and some school districts removed and banned. We're at literally banning books. Books on Rosa Parks are being banned. So that's something that's really real now. And right now, I really have to give more thought to. I don't know how we get through, except to hope that perhaps some action at the national level, some policy changes at the national level will help assuage that. But right now, I don't know, because it's so fluid right now. I'm not sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe, too. I have a question about intersectionality, because in our audience, I think we need to have allies, the indigenous movement and the rainbow movement. And I mean, how do we, and I noticed that Day's article talks about even the official Canadian multicultural discourse can be an allied discourse. So we want to have more allies. But then how do we navigate this intersectionality?
Yeah, here's one way that I kind of look at it. When I look structurally at what white privilege and white supremacy has done throughout the centuries, it's done a wonderful job of divide and conquer. It has, in many ways, helped us to look at each other instead of all of us together looking at structural racism and white supremacy and white privilege. So it is essential. In Heather McGhee's book, she talks about the solidarity dividend, in which the point is we have to see, and each of our differing groups, we have to see the strength in collective action. We absolutely have to. One of the things that Heather McGhee focuses on is union and unionization. And she juxtaposed those union movements that have been successful against those who are not. And invariably, the linchpin that's prevented unions in areas, especially of the United States South, has been race. It is just used incredibly effectively. We, as divergent groups, we've got to see our collective commonalities. And it is not against each other, it is against that establishment. If we can look more at, that's why I liked Occupy Wall Street. I mean, I thought that movement was, yeah, that's it. And when we saw some of the protests against what's happening around policing in this country, I had some hope. But that, to me, is what it takes. We have got to stop looking at our own differences and look at what is really separating us, or what has really made it bad for all of us. So, and what continues to dominate the narrative in this country. That's sort of, it sounds so simple, but then again, even though for all the wrong reasons, for a bad reason, but the amount of focus that Asian Americans in this country are getting because of the recent attacks, even though they've been gone on throughout the existence of Asians in this country, but most recently, and I know because of social media and our media, we are now seeing more collective action meetings across races, to address this. I see more Asians at some of the protests that are in defense of Black lives. And when we had some protests, I live in Washington, so we protest every day here about something. So I'm often really privy to who's attending and who's there, and I am seeing more of that. I'd like to see more. We have to understand more about what brings us together and what keeps us apart. And that's one area I'm somewhat hopeful in. I am seeing more collective action across racial lines.
Talking about social media, I'd like to invite Qinghua to ask a question about social media, because it plays such a great role in perpetuating racism.
Yes, Dr. Lin and Dr. Grant, thank you for the chance to ask the question. Yes, I do. I personally, I'm a heavy user of social media myself. And besides receiving a lot of information about collective movements on social media and seeing those posts, social media has also been a very important connection for like a very important platform for personal connection. And also, of course, the issues that we are talking about today invades into that domain as well. So I have personally experienced in many cases that I have friends that who may have never experienced who may have never interacted with people from other race, but still holding very strong beliefs, holding very strong like prejudice beliefs against against other people. So I see that quite often, and sometimes it is even difficult for me to be able to engage in a conversation that's going to be meaningful for both of us. We can easily build up emotions because we disagree with each other so much, so we just shut up. We just don't want to hear each other. We just don't want to communicate with each other anymore. So my question has more be like this: because on the social media, usually we have chance to talk to people who we do not have a very close relationship with. It can be a friend that I met online. It can be like maybe my running buddy that I don't have such a close connection with, like in comparison to my families. So yeah, so when we have this kind of when this kind of issues when the race issues and topics sprout up in the conversation and we disagree, and I feel like, so what's the best strategy, or what a strategy that you have been like using in like talking to people about these issues, especially for people who do not agree with what we are saying here and people who have strong emotions against it?
Okay, I'm probably revealing my age, but I have no presence on social media. None. I do have a Facebook account, but I have no presence on social media. Um, because I'm not a visual learner. Yeah, I'm not. For one thing. But that's tough because I know that so many people are really grappling with that now. I mean, for me, I found my solution. I have no presence on social media.
Okay.
But for those who do, perhaps it's a bit like how I might handle someone maybe face to face
Right.
when it clearly is a disagreement. And I will often one strategy is to say, well, that's one way to look at it. But, I think what's important is not to attack the person's position, and say, that's interesting. And even if you're given a question where you really, it's like, okay, that's really a dumb question, you can say, let me think about that. I mean, you really if your goal is to keep the communication going and not lose the relationship and maybe perhaps grow it, grow that relationship, sometimes you just have to either walk away or entertain the idea that no, this is not how I feel, but that's an interesting way to look at it. And another thing is ask, like what is kind of informing that? Sort of engage them in a discussion around not what they believe, but why do they feel that way? Not so much not attacking the position, but trying to question how they got to that point. Or
I
just ignore it like I do.
actually, yes, I'm actually, like you started off talking about the urgency, because I heard recently from an Asian young person, a high school kid, who's an immigrant from Asia, and he was saying something that deeply troubles me. But like what Tsinghua just said, I don't want to give a mini lecture. It won't work. Because he's himself just a 4-year immigrant. I mean, he's been in Canada for 4 or 5 years, and he's now a grade 10 student. And I think he must have picked up the discourse or ideology from his school playground, from the mainstream discourse, which is the jungle law discourse. So I was hearing something like, he was saying something that deeply troubles me. He was saying, why should the white people apologize to the indigenous people? If they can't win the battle, they deserve to be conquered. And at that moment, I didn't know what to say. His mom was sitting next to me, so I couldn't say anything. But I felt deeply troubled. And I know that he's just revoicing the playground discourse that he has been exposed to. It must be the mainstream white discourse in the playground that he has picked up.
Yeah.
I mean, as an immigrant child from Asia, I mean, instead of being an ally to the indigenous people, he's becoming an ally to the white kids who is mobilizing this jungle law discourse. And I'm deeply troubled. And I'm also deeply sad because I didn't know what to say at the moment. And I still don't know what to say now.
Yeah. And that's tough, because in a situation like that, it has to be backed up by what the parents are saying. I think Beverly Tatum, I believe, I can remember the name of the book, Why Are All Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And one of the things she points out in the initial chapter of that book, because a lot of it is a story of her child, but also she goes through the stages of racialization and racial identity. But one thing that comes right at the beginning is how early children's attitudes and perspectives on race are formulated. It's amazing. And one of the stories she tells is that her son started preschool. This is preschool. He was 3 or 4 years old and came home and asked her, "Why did you give me too much chocolate milk?" One of his playmates had indicated to him the reason he was dark is because he drank too much chocolate milk. So we know now that those attitudes start to formulate so early around race, around difference, who is othered. And we certainly do it. And again, I'm speaking from the US perspective, even in the games and the toys that are available to children. The dolls, we've gotten a lot better on the dolls. But I know when I grew up, there were no dolls of color. I preferred a book anyway, so it really didn't matter. But there wasn't. That says something to a child. That communicates. So in all these subtle ways, even before they begin formal schooling, we've communicated that to them. Who is the other and who is better?
And this, you just mentioned the white privileged people mobilize this divide and conquer strategy. So that they said, oh, the Asian model minority. And then I have this question from Shiner in the comments. Thank you very much for the very insightful talk, Dr. Grant. I'm a Muslim woman of color and an international student here in Canada. My question is, to what extent can we push boundaries while operating under hierarchical ideological structures and the pervasive notion of European nations as the quote-unquote superior nations that is present not only within the white community, but also within the people of our own ethnic communities who immigrate to Western countries for better life. So it resonates with what we just said.
I appreciate that, because it made me think about, I teach in New York, and for all of the PR about how diverse New York is, it's not diverse. You see a lot of people that look differently, but it's not diverse in terms of how people blend and meld together. Not at all. So we have in my program probably the strongest presence of Arabic speaking and people of the Muslim faith, and it's very deliberate on my part because I saw that, and this is where those individual acts have to come into play, raising your consciousness. And for me, it was like, I'm not Muslim, but I see that there is a climate here that is, if not anti-Muslim, certainly not welcoming. So and this is a small thing, but it was so appreciated by my students of who speak Arabic and other Muslim faith. Whenever Ramadan occurs, I send out a list of books, and I send out a acknowledgement of Ramadan and well wishes, and that it's just sometimes it's little things like that. And over the years, even I bought the books when we're face to face during Ramadan, especially in one or two of the literacy courses that I teach. I bring the books in, I share those books. So it takes that in those kinds of individual acts. Like my consciousness was raised for me as a woman of color. I'm the only one here, and at least of African descent. And sometimes it's just little gestures like that. It was no big deal to me, but I know how there was an air, and on Staten Island and in other places in New York as well, there have been some attacks against Muslim women in particular have been attacked when they are alone and most vulnerable. So for me, it's a small thing, but it showed that I'm an ally.
Now I'm aware of the time. I would like to go for a last round of questions among our hosts. So over to you, Bongki, again.
I'm just still trying to grapple with the notion of microaggression. And I found it very impactful and powerful because microaggression is micro. So therefore it's very invisible.
Mhm.
And then it's also mentally shocking when this happens, and it's very difficult to address that microaggression because the microaggression doesn't come as racism, but it comes with different forms of you done something wrong, but that implies race stereotypes and so forth. And we talked about issues of social, like how to address issues in a structural manner, but microaggression comes with our daily lives, and which we breathe and live and so forth. And what will be a way for us to, not us, but not only us, but the other in others, to address the microaggression, negative effects of microaggression?
I know exactly what you mean. I suffer it all the time. But
it lasts all the time. Even if
all
one,
the time,
yeah, and one person says something and it lasts for years and years and years.
And you're like, do you realize what you just said or what you just implied? But I have found especially when it is an individual who I will be able to continue to engage in, I note it, and I make a point at some point. Maybe it's not as effective at that moment, but later I take a mental note of it and I find a way. If I hold it, I find a way later to point it out, but in a way that is not confrontational, because they are so small, but they're collective in their impact on the negative impact on you. And that's been my strategy, because many of the microaggressions I have come from my colleagues. So I'm going to be in another room with them at a time strategically when I can make a point of noting to them how I took what was said. And that has been, for my colleagues and for people that I'm repeatedly in contact with, that's been one of the things that I do. It's like, you may forget, but I won't forget. And there will be a time when it is appropriate for me, and I can strategically let you know how offended I was by that.
Do you also, as a senior scholar, have you seen some of the changes in your department, or any changes in your colleagues?
In my department, absolutely no. In the School of Education, absolutely no. In CUNY as a system, no. But within my relationships with my colleagues, yes. And because I have been able to identify allies. And it gets tricky too, because I have silent allies. I have allies who will, I don't know if I should label them as allies, but they're sympathetic to my cause, let's put it like that. But because of the overall culture there, it is very difficult for my white colleagues who are allies, who will privately let me know they support me, but will never publicly speak out when someone attacks me, will never publicly speak out. So I've had to kind of resign myself to that, but continue to work with them. It's like they're in the learning process. It's a developmental process. Maybe one day they'll get there when they'll be able to speak out more publicly, but they're not. So I have my silent sympathizers. I don't have a single colleague who will speak out publicly. And partly, I know it's because those who are my silent partners are not tenured. And that it's constantly hanging over them. And I get that.
I get that too. That's why your point about mentoring and seeking out emerging scholars, I think in our generation, we might not live to see a day when there is less racism. Yeah. However, it's generations and generations work. On that note, Phoebe, I'd like to invite you. You represent the younger generation.
I do reflect on the issues you all addressed just now. To me, I think I agree with Rachel that literature is a good channel to explore life narratives and stories. And also you mentioned that for postgraduate level, we may introduce narrative inquiry. But for me as well, as a teacher to some design students, because I usually interact with design majors at my school, I think that a lot of other possibilities can be explored in our future generation or existing generation. For example, we have museum art, theater art, and all those visual elements of storytelling may uplift our awareness and also spirits to experience different kind of anti-racist creativity or agency or imagination. For example, in some art exhibition, maybe sometimes we can use the mirror effects to see how the visitors, when they see the same classic pictures or images, actually they are also reflecting on their positionality. What do I see if I look at the mirror of all those visual display, and then I'm a black lady or I'm a young kid with different colors? So all these are possibility, but of course, as a question to put forward, I would say, you mentioned to Chinghua just now that you do not have any presence in the social media. But I think nowadays, because people love to talk about digital literacy, and I have raised a question about the digital literacy as well, especially during the pandemic situation, because we are getting used to the new modes of interaction. So I would like to ask a question now about, from your perspective as an established scholar, what can we do if we want to collaborate with you? I mean, the established generation, what do you want us to produce with you? If we can have the cross-generational projects, yeah. Professor Lin is very keen on this. I can see her passion, yeah.
All you need to do is email me. You won't find me on Facebook, but
Yeah,
no,
sure, sure.
I am an angel, and Dr. Lin will tell you, I collaboration really feeds me. I just enjoy it enormously. And I've been really blessed to have people who feel similarly. So, as I said, I have 2 projects with junior faculty in my department. My former doctoral students that I had in Thailand, I have a couple projects. One is under review. My very first doctoral student is from Thailand. And he and I will be meeting tomorrow to discuss a collaboration. So I welcome, I honestly do. And now that I've got a little bit of wiggle room and not so much climbing, the academic ladder, it opens me up for more collaborative work. And please do, if you have an idea, email me. I'll be working, in fact, with a doctoral student from Thailand in the spring, who's in Canada right now. And I have my connections there. And one of the students that I had in the class when I was in Thailand told her about me. She got in contact. So she'll be coming to work with me next spring. Yeah, spring.
I just have an idea, Phoebe and Tsinghua. Can you create this digital presence for Professor Grant?
Yeah.
I mean, they can easily do it. I mean, it will take me ages to get something up, but they can do it within an hour. I mean, they can give your talk such a big publicity, putting it on social media or creating. Phoebe is so good using apps to create all kinds of lovely social media posters and maybe narratives, comic strips, graphic novels, turning your talk, your seminar into a graphic novel. Tsinghua?
Yes, I would like to first remind Dr. Grant that you are already on social media now, as now we are broadcasting to the world.
As hard as I fought it.
Well, I have been thinking about the things that you mentioned. I think I do agree with you a lot. Just now you talked about how to interact with people who strongly disagree, because that's the question that's always on my mind. I feel like in online environment on the social media, it is at a maybe a disadvantageous position for that kind of interaction, because you can easily block this person forever. You don't want to see him again. So whatever bad words you say seems to be okay. So yeah, I think that's also related to the work that I'm doing. So I really feel that on social media, it is still that we need to have a certain kind of I would say awareness or emotional, maybe not in intelligence is not emotional awareness in interacting with other people on social media over these issues, so that it is so that social media is not just a place for for just pushing us apart. So I really like the idea that you discussed today. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to get there. And it's odd because I started when I went to CUNY, there were and still there aren't any accredited programs that offer a degree fully online, except for mine. So I very much embrace and appreciate technology. I just don't have a social media presence.
I depend on these young scholars to help me. I mean,
That's why I collaborate with young scholars.
and also I think as depressing and discouraging as it is, our hope lies in the next generation. That's why I'm investing so much time and energy to establish a community of scholars across generation. So we might be recruiting you into this cross-generation community. Now, before we close our every good thing, every banquet has an end. You have given us such a sumptuous banquet of ideas, intellectual banquet. But it's also a very difficult topic and a very urgent topic. So before we close our seminar today, I'd like every one of our hosts will say something, and then it's not really an ending; it's just a beginning of how we can really tackle this urgent and tough issue. So back to Bongi.
First of all, I've been thinking about back to social media when I'm hearing about the different kinds of project, the interesting project that you had. I was like, where can I get those information? Like what? So like talking about the presence of social media and then sharing us about your knowledge, it will be so grateful. Like it will be so exciting. And then I want to also address the importance of the sister scholars, the presence of the sister scholars, because you guys are one of the very first one who actually addressed this issue in our field. And until that, it was internalized as individual fault. Like it's my fault. It's me who didn't address it, or it's me who did not learn enough. And I also has internalized that the sense of inferiority. And then when the sister scholars announced these issues and in a very vivid manner, and then after 20 years after you guys come back to it and then address it again, and it makes me to learn as someone who is learning these issues in a quiet room by myself, now can be able to have a conversation about how do we navigate this? How do we address it in a diplomatic way that we no longer become an individual, but we become somewhat collective? And I was quite fearful about today's discussion because it actually becomes very personal discussion than somewhat scholarly discussion. So I was really a little bit anxious but at the same time, very excited about this. And I hope that we can continue this conversation and have a collective action and identity together. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
The personal is political. The personal is scholarly. The personal is important. Thanks, Bongi. Over to you, Phoebe.
Hi, Rachel. I really love to spend more time with you. As a reader from your publications and also your sharing just now, I really admire your awareness and also your wisdom. And I feel happy for you and other sister scholars who have been experienced all the life story and creating very beautiful life narratives for us to learn more how to embrace harmony and also to accept that there are struggles and realities. I sincerely hope that more people will join your allies, and then more people will understand the beauty of what you are doing for us and for the world. And as a young researcher, I really want to pick up more from you and from Professor Lin and from Kubota and also other sister scholars. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again in international conferences and also keep reading your books and journal papers around. And I would like to make friends with your doctoral students in the future as well and join our younger generation of digital presence or literacy developments. Yeah, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. Last but not least, Qinghua.
Hi, Dr. Grant. Thank you so much again for coming today. I think it's very timely session for me, actually. I'm preparing for my interviews for my PhD, actually, and it's aspects of topic that I cannot ignore. So I think it has been quite informing personally for me as well. And I would also like to say that I'm looking forward to future opportunities to collaborate with you and also your students as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you. And I think Phoebe and Xinhua, if you could think of social media strategies to promote the sister scholars' presence, that would be very, very strategic. And also, yeah.
I will make sure I need to share with you my PowerPoint, and I will make sure that I do that. Okay.
Yeah, and maybe we can find a way of sharing it on social media as well. So thank you, everybody. I have the audience who have stayed on with us, tuned in with us. Thank you so much. And we will have more seminars in October and in November. So we are very blessed with a very good community of student and postdoc hosts. They are our next generation. Our hope lies in you. Okay. So once again, thanks so much, Rachel, Professor Grant, and thanks to our audience and to our hosts, both in Hong Kong, getting up so early, and in Canada. So until next time, tune in. We will have seminars in October and in November. So bye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.